We can't be dogmatic if that's the case. But let's assume that it's true, but if it is, it's not the whole truth. The impression one gets from this statement is that the transmission of the New Testament is like the telephone game. It's a game that every child knows. You whisper something into somebody's ear, it goes down through 10 or 12 people, and then that last person spits it out to the whole crowd, and everybody laughs because the message got totally garbled. There's absolutely no motivation to get it right. But copying of New Testament manuscripts is hardly like this parlor game. First of all, the message is passed on in writing, not just orally. Secondly, textual critics do not rely on just the last person, but can examine the work of several scribes who are closer to the original source. Third, patristic writers are commenting on the text as it's going through its transmissional history. And when there are chronological gaps among the manuscripts, and we have quite a few, these writers often fill in those gaps by telling us what the text said in that place in their day. And finally, in the telephone game, once the story is told by one person, that individual has nothing else to do with it. It's out of his or her hands. But the original New Testament books were almost surely copied more than once and probably several times. And they were probably consulted even after a few generations of copies had already been produced. My second argument is that Barth speaks of the first 200 years of copying as uncontrolled, giving the impression that all manuscripts of this era were riddled with mistakes, both unintentional and intentional. The scribes, it seems, were undisciplined and wild, freely adding or subtracting words whenever they wanted to. But this is not the whole story. The standard introduction to New Testament textual criticism puts things in perspective. It would be a mistake to think that the uncontrolled copying practices that led to the formation of the Western textual tradition were followed everywhere that texts were reproduced in the Roman Empire. In particular, there's solid evidence that in at least one major see of early Christendom, the city of Alexandria, there was conscious and conscientious control exercised in the copying of the books of the New Testament. Textual witnesses connected to Alexandria attest a high quality of textual transmission from the earliest times. It was there that a very ancient line of text was copied and preserved. These words are found in the 4th edition of the Text of the New Testament by Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman. Now, we can illustrate the quality of the Alexandrian manuscripts with two manuscripts that Bart and I would both agree are two of the very best New Testament manuscripts we have, if not the two best. Papyrus 75 and Codex Vaticanus, also known as B. Their agreement is higher than that of any other two early manuscripts. P75 is 100 to 150 years older than B, and yet it is not an ancestor of B. Instead, B copied from an earlier common ancestor that both B and P75 were related to. The combination of both of these manuscripts in a particular reading goes back most likely to early in the 2nd century. And third, the standard Greek New Testament in use today is known as the Nestle Aland text. It not only produces what the editors believe is the wording of the original New Testament, but also lists tens of thousands of variants. Here's a picture of the text. They list 116 places where scholars over the centuries have thought that none of the Greek manuscripts have the original wording. If the manuscripts were so corrupt from very early times, then we would have a terribly corrupt text where we wouldn't have a clue what the original wording was in hundreds and hundreds of places. There's 116 that the editors list. They accept only one: the addition of a single letter to the end of a word in Acts 16:12. And yet two of the editors, Kurt Aland and Bruce Metzger, felt that even in that one place the original wording was to be found among the manuscripts. What Aland and Metzger were arguing is that when it comes to the wording of the New Testament, it can be found either above the line or below the line in the Nestle Aland text. In other words, the autographic text is found in A, B, or C, never none of the above. Finally, we can say even more. The vast majority of New Testament scholars believe that the wording of the autographs is not only recoverable, but that we have recovered it in most places. Total skepticism is uncalled for. In Exhibit A are Barth's many books on the New Testament. In these books, he presupposes knowledge of the wording of the autographs. Here are just some of the titles that you can see. Notice, Orthodox corruption of Scripture, misquoting Jesus. The text of the New Testament, its transmission, corruption, and restoration. And Forged, writing in the name of God, why the Bible's authors are not who we think they are. Take just the last book, published earlier this year, as an illustration. In Forged, Barth argues that Paul did not write 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, or Titus, collectively known as the pastoral epistles. One of his arguments is that the vocabulary of these letters is not the same as what we find in Paul's authentic letters. Now, in order for him to make that claim, he has to know what the words are in Paul's other letters, as well as what the words are in the pastoral letters. Regardless of what some of us may think about his argument in Forged, this book simply could not have been written unless Barth was sure about the wording of the original text in almost every place. And the same is true for all his books on the New Testament. Is what we have now what the New Testament authors wrote nearly 2,000 years ago? It almost certainly is in all essentials. Even in most particulars, we can be relatively sure. To be uber skeptical about this in the face of the mountain of evidence is to take a leap of faith where the guardrail should have been. It is far more reasonable to be relatively sure that we can recover the wording of the original New Testament text than to be radically skeptical about the entire endeavor. Thank you for your attention.